Back to today's video. Today is Friday, October 25th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at the state of the race nationwide. My 2024 election prediction less than 2 weeks out from the 2024 presidential election, 7 days after my most recent prediction on October 17th. This prediction comes amidst a number of new polls showing the race tightening yet again, something you have heard me say over the past month very consistently as we've gotten closer to election. The numbers have started to tighten in many battleground states as well on the national average, with two new high-quality polls from CNN and SSRS saying that the nationwide poll is tied. The New York Times and Siena College also releasing their head-to-head numbers nationwide, also showing a tie, a reverse in direction and a trend line that benefits the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, in a number of these battleground states and across the nation. Now, Kamala Harris is still on track to hold her own in many battleground states, as well as Donald Trump, but what really comes down to the wire here is how these individual voters in just a handful of states really do make up the outcome of this election. 10, 20, 30,000 voters that have been swinging back and forth since July 21st when Kamala Harris got to the top of the ticket. And so what we've seen in terms of recent trends in the early vote numbers are also some good results for the Republican Party at large. Really high turnout numbers in states like Nevada, and just generally speaking, not enough of a firewall compared to that of 2022 or 2020 in states like Pennsylvania. And generally speaking across the country, Republican turnout does seem to be up higher. Now, we are missing a bit on the understanding of that maybe a lot of Democrats are in fact voting on election day. We are working in a very different environment than the COVID-19 pandemic that made a lot of Democrats more inclined to vote by mail for the first time ever. Historically, the vote by mail vote typically skewed towards Republicans because older voters had decided that they were going to vote by mail historically, until Donald Trump really pushed that narrative that voting by mail was illogical, voting by mail was rigged. Up until 2024, when he reversed course on all of that all of that discussion, we saw that the early vote very much favored Democrats. Now we're starting to see a balance of it. Early vote numbers in the rural areas are doing really good for the Republican Party, not so much for Democrats, and the mail-in numbers, of course, are generally better for Democrats in comparison to 2016 and 2012, but when compared to 2020 and 2022, not as much. And so there's a lot that has been informing my decision, my choices here when it comes down to who I believe will predict, who I am going to predict will win the election as of today. And I think we are in a very interesting position because, genuinely speaking, almost every single battleground state is a true and total toss-up. Now, there are some states that we know just won't be competitive. These are states, not Indiana, but these are states that are safe blue and safe red that are going to go to the respective parties that are being characterized as winning them right now, regardless of who the party nominees are going to be. So, for instance, if Donald Trump was to drop out and, whoever wanted to replace him, Nikki Haley, J.D. Vance, was to reach the top of the ticket, they would still win any of the states I'm characterizing thus far in the Republican column. It wouldn't matter who they ran, how they ran, if they ran, the Republican Party would win and Democrats certainly would not. Now, Democrats start off, traditionally speaking, with a slight upper hand when it comes down to safe states. Any state expected to be won by 15 points or higher, and no chance that any opposition party is able to win there is what constitutes a safe state. And that really makes up a significant chunk of the electorate here. I mean, you're talking over 270-ish electoral votes that are characterized as states that Republicans and Democrats don't need to worry about and don't need to spend money in, and just quite frankly, don't need to visit with the exception of fundraisers, as we've seen for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. But when it comes down to these 244 quote-unquote toss-up electoral votes, not all of them are going to be toss-ups. Many of them are what we like to call likely states, meaning they'll vote for the respective candidate by 5 to 15 points, and it's not entirely out of the question that in some strange reality that the opposition party wins them. But generally speaking, the incumbent party in these states and the respective parties that I'm about to characterize them as winning are going to do quite well, meaning they win from anywhere up to 5 to 15 points. Predicting the margin here will be pretty substantive for the political party that comes out on top. And so what this means are states like South Carolina, where Donald Trump will likely win by 12 to 13 points. It's not enough to say it's safe in a landslide scenario. Maybe there could be a Democratic victory in a state like that. But as of right now, just based on margin, Donald Trump wins the state. He also wins a state like Alaska. As of recent, we've seen some new data saying that he's up 8 or 9 points across the state. Pretty substantial victory. It's a reduction from 2020, but Alaska has had a bit of a leftward trend since the 2012 and 2008 elections, so it makes a bit of sense, but overall, Donald Trump holding his own. In Iowa and Ohio, not much of a shift there away from the Republican Party compared to 2020 and 2016. In fact, in some of these states, we might actually see Donald Trump improve off his 2020 margin, maybe not match 2016. In some cases, he'll match it. We will really just have to come down to the wire on election night and actually unpack some of these results. But so far, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are going to win states like Iowa, Ohio, South Carolina, and Alaska. by far more than 5 points. Now, when it comes down to some of the states and areas in which we're likely going to see, likely, no pun intended, the Republicans win by somewhere closer to 5 points rather than 15 points, are states like Maine's 2nd Congressional District, where the Republicans are set to win in this district by somewhere around 6 or 7 points. Obviously, that's not good for Democrats, but it's not enough to say that this district is solid or key for the Republican Party. It's a district that they're going to win, and they're going to do so by an impressive margin, but it's not so far as to say it's long gone for Democrats, nor should they invest in it. There's a competitive congressional race that, depending on Donald Trump's margin, could go to the Democrats. Republicans also are slated to win Florida by roughly 6 or 7 points, maybe even more. Based on that early voting number, potentially 9, 10, 11 points. We will have to wait and see. Texas, a state that right now we've seen a trend line in the upward direction for the former president. He went from being up just 4 points in September. By the end of that month, we saw that he went up to 5 points in the most recent poll we've seen across the state, up to 6 points, 7 points. And so really an improvement in Texas, enough to say Donald Trump is expected to win the state by a larger margin than the 2020 election when he won the state by 5.6% against President Biden. But Democrats have their own set of likely states too. These are states like Maine at large, where Maine is one of 2 states like Nebraska that votes down by congressional district, meaning every other state is winner take all. In Maine and Nebraska, they get to vote based on individual districts. So if Nebraska's first wants to go blue and the rest of the state wants to go red, 1 vote out of Nebraska goes blue, 4 votes go red. Same thing in the state of Maine, which is why that 2nd district there is in Donald Trump's column, and that actually does contribute to Donald Trump's victory, even though the winner at large in the state overall goes to Kamala Harris. So Maine there goes to the Democrats. Maine 2nd. Nebraska 2nd is also a district that Democrats are going to likely win in by 6, 7, 8, 9 points. We've actually started to see some massive improvements here for the Democratic Party compared to 2020. And a big reason for this, too, I think, is the attention that Democrats are giving there. Donald Trump tried to take away the vote from that 2nd district there. So really, we're at a point where many of the voters in the District 1 probably feel betrayed by the former president. Why is it that you're trying to steal our vote, take it away, not make it as relevant, lose all the money that goes to the Omaha media market, all of these things, right? It gives Tim Walz a reason to visit the state. It gives Democratic surrogates a reason to visit the district. Overall, it's a net positive for the Omaha area in terms of finances when they have a competitive swing district. Take it away, they lose those finances. And so that's part of the calculus as to why you do, in fact, see some Republicans crossing over to vote for Kamala Harris just to stick it to Donald Trump, who tried to take away that 2nd district voting right, something that voters in Nebraska did not positively respond to. But there's an amendment on the ballot that will, discuss whether or not this is something that the Republican legislature, or not even, in theory, unicameral legislature, so only one chamber here, but the Republicans decided to take up and make state law. So Republicans at 219, Democrats at 184. They also have Minnesota, Tim Walz's home state, that they'll likely win anywhere from 6 to 8 points. New Hampshire, same deal, 6 to 8 point range. Virginia will probably see a reduction in support compared to 2020, somewhere around a 7, 8, 9 point victory. Sort of indicates that bleeding that the Democratic ticket has seen compared to 2020, at least as of right now. The margins here aren't large enough to say that Virginia would in fact expand on 2020, and a big reason for that too, I think, is just simply that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party invested a lot more time and effort into the state. There was more resources to go around, and Virginia was a state that arguably, Hillary Clinton only won by less than 5 points with her running mate being from Virginia. It was reasonable to conclude in 2020 that it would be more competitive. This cycle, Virginia is not viewed as a competitive state, not to the same extent at least, and so it's not receiving the same attention, time, money, resources, which can explain some of the Democratic bleeding. In Colorado and New Mexico, same thing here. We'll see reductions in support compared to 2020, but Kamala Harris will still win the states at large. So down to the 93 toss-up electoral votes, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Donald Trump at 219 and Kamala Harris at 226 really goes to show that these 7 battleground states that Biden and Trump pinpointed in January 2023, when it was clear that both candidates would be running in the 2024 election, these were the 7 states that everybody knew it would come down to. Nobody insinuated anything else. There was no extensive outreach or focus group efforts or anything like that in in New Hampshire, in New Mexico, in Colorado, in Virginia, and Minnesota. What they knew was true, that the 7 battleground states wouldn't go through Texas. They wouldn't go through Florida. They would go through Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So, 93 remaining toss-up electoral votes. Let's go through it. Now, one thing that you might have noticed in my recent predictions is that Donald Trump has been winning in some of these states by a tilt margin, and so has Kamala Harris. A tilt margin, what I like to use anywhere that I think a state is going to be decided by less than 1 point. As of the recent week, I think we now have some states that return to being in what we call the lean column, a state that's going to be decided by 1 to 5 points. Now, I think we're going to be on the lower end for all of these states, whether they're tilt, means it's going to be closer to 0%, or lean means it's closer to 1% than anything else. That's where we are in this race. It truly is a toss-up. But based on my last prediction, let's make some movements. To start off, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada were all states Donald Trump won in my most recent election prediction by a tilt margin. What I think has happened here thus far, I think North Carolina keeps its tilt red characterization. And I'd argue, Georgia and Arizona have a bit more interesting results that we can definitely spend time unpacking in the future. But North Carolina right now, I think there's a strong possibility North Carolina votes to the left of Georgia. There also is a possibility Georgia, like 2020, votes to the left of North Carolina. I'm at a point right now where I think Donald Trump's influence in states like North Carolina and Georgia, in a way, can't be captured in true form unless we're on election day. And the reason I say that is because a lot of what comes down to North Carolina and Georgia isn't necessarily just suburban voters turning out, right? In states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where white voters make up a significant chunk of the population, and there obviously are urban areas, which large amounts of minority voters that Democrats rely on for victory, obviously that matters. But in states like North Carolina and Georgia, turnout is going to be so key and crucial because right now, what we're seeing in terms of the early voting numbers aren't phenomenal results for Democrats. I'd say that North Carolina is actually on the verge of being a lean Republican state, though I do think some of the recent data points in the state direct me into saying North Carolina might be one of those states because of the heavy investments and routine visits from Kamala Harris that North Carolina right now remains tilt red. But Georgia, I think, shifts over to being lean red, from tilt to lean Republican. Donald Trump, I think, wins Georgia from anywhere to 1 to 2 points. Now, moving over to Arizona and Nevada, it's tricky as well. I equally think that, Kamala Harris has a unique appeal to voters when they're voting on something like an abortion referendum on their ballot. When a lot of the conversation extending beyond the presidential election, Arizona doesn't have a Senate election up, it's largely surrounding itself. It does have a Senate election, governor election. A lot of that conversation around governing and who can implement laws and bans and veto them, that comes down to the role of the president. In 2022, Democrats benefited from the fact that abortion was top of mind for many voters, especially in states like Arizona, where abortion was not protected, unlike Nevada. On top of the fact, too, Arizona is a state where, as of recent, we have seen draconian abortion laws take place across the state that required the Republican legislature to overturn it. That's good for the Republican Party because they've been able to really walk back some of these more extreme narratives that have been forming around them surrounding abortion, but it's not great. I also think on that flip side, so that's one side of the equal weight, the other side is too that in a state like Arizona and arguably Nevada, states that are very close to the southern border, have a massive Latino population that Democrats used to rely on for victory. If Democrats are seeing any type of bleeding amongst that support, given how narrow Arizona was in 2020, I think Kamala Harris loses the state to Donald Trump. And I think it's no longer in that tilt category. I think we're up to a lean point where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance at 262, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz at 226. Now, I still think Kamala Harris can win Arizona. I'm not writing it off whatsoever. It is absolutely a winnable state, and Kamala Harris is uniquely also powerful enough that she can do well in these Sunbelt states, and we've known that to be the case on multiple instances. But it also comes down to that point that Arizona and Georgia are two states where Democrats don't have massive margins by any means from 2020 to rely on and say, we can lose a few points and still win, unlike a state like Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania. And so with that, what do we have? 262 for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. 226 for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And then moving over to the state of Nevada. This is a state that I think I'm going to keep as a tilt Republican state until we get more early voting data in roughly 4 or 5 days. And then by the time we reach election day, should this data point show worse results for Democrats than right now or what it's showing right now, this state I think Donald Trump wins hands down. So what matters between now and election day? Democrats have a lot of outstanding ballots. Democrats have a lot of outstanding voters. They can make up the margin. But as of right now, we are not seeing anything similar even to 2016 when Hillary Clinton also won Nevada despite losing nationwide. Why? Because the Democratic support in the state has started to reduce itself. And so should Nevada go red, the signs are here. The signs are predicting Donald Trump's in the advantage point right now. And I still agree, as of my recent prediction, that Donald Trump wins Nevada. So coming down to the 3 final battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Where are we at? Well, for one, across these 3 states, the Democratic Party and Republican Party have spent close to $500 million in investments in various races, especially on the presidential level. Donald Trump has visited all of these states, Kamala Harris has visited all of these states, and in the final week of the campaign next week, this upcoming Sunday through Sunday, a lot of the time will be spent in these Rust Belt states. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are in the final stretch of this campaign period. And as of right now, the upper hand is slightly tilted towards the former president. Now, Kamala Harris, I think, given what we've seen, even though the Democratic firewall is not as strong as they would have liked, I still think Pennsylvania is a very narrow Kamala Harris state. I do think that the Democratic Party has done enough to really ramp up what they need to see in some of these states and are counting, and I think counting matters because they need to see this for it to actually happen, but I think they likely will. Is that similar to what happened in 2022? Some of these states with a more nationalized race here, while sure had been competitive in the past, sometimes reject Trumpism, and Pennsylvania was a big rejection of that. But when it comes down to Michigan and Wisconsin, it is a bit trickier. While Kamala Harris had the advantage in these states as of recent, I've started to see that really slip in some of the battlegrounds. I think Kamala Harris, call it right now, wins Michigan by a tilt margin. It's going to be close, and it will come down to the wire, largely because many of these Democratic voters that used to be all in for Biden, all in for Clinton, all in for Obama, have, in their words, abandoned Harris. Now, it's not massive enough to say there's no possible way of winning in Michigan, and you have seen some Republicans walk away from the former president, even members of Congress like Fred Upton, who represented southwestern Michigan for 18 terms in Congress, 36 years, and was a well-known and well-liked figure across the state. I equally think, too, it's going to be a balancing act here. Kamala Harris, I think, can narrowly come out ahead, given that Biden won the state by 3, but it's not massive enough to say that it's not a state that Donald Trump can't win, right? Donald Trump can still win Michigan, just as Kamala Harris could win North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And when it comes down to this final state, Wisconsin, 10 electoral votes, this is what I think is going to happen. I think because the Democratic Party, given some of these numbers that we are looking at right now, and given the general trend line, as of today, Donald Trump wins Wisconsin. And with that, he wins the presidency. It's a state that is really, really down to the wire and is exceptionally close. That's undeniable. But Donald Trump's increase in support is one thing that just cannot be ignored. This rebound that we've seen that dates him all the way back to just the week after Kamala Harris entered into the race was the last time he had a lead this high on the 538 forecast. And the numbers we're seeing out of these states sort of reminds me of what we saw with Senator Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. Despite clear associations with the former president, obviously the former president being on that ballot, and despite some outlandish comments being made. In this nationalized race, the Democrats lost that race. They also won this state by 0.6% in 2020, hardly near the 3 points that Michigan went to Joe Biden by, and hardly near the 1.5% or 1.2% that Biden won Pennsylvania by. It was the closest state in 2020, and it was the best state for Trump out of the 3 in 2016. And given recent election cycles, I would argue that Wisconsin, as of today, goes to the former president, and with it, the presidency. This race has been, for a while now, up in the air. But this is my first prediction since forever, with Kamala Harris on the ticket, that Donald Trump wins the election. And we are 11 days out from Election Day. Things can change, though. As they have over the past 2 weeks, it went from being a 290, map for Kamala Harris to 260. But things can go back in favor of Kamala Harris, and we could likely see that between now and Election Day. It will just take a lot for it to happen, but it is not something that can't happen. A lot of these states are well within the margin of error, too, meaning that the polls that we're seeing come out of these states can sometimes and will likely be wrong on Election Day. But that's, something that we have to keep in mind as we go through these battlegrounds and we go through the analysis of them. But some of these early voting numbers favor Republicans. Some of these recent polling numbers nationally and statewide favor Republicans. And if there was ever a time for Donald Trump to really surge back to being in a much better position, that time for his campaign would be now. And we're starting to see early signs of it. Can Democrats stop it and put a halt to it? Possibly. In 2012, we started to see this reversion in support away from Barack Obama, and eventually on Election Day, Barack Obama still won. By the time we reached the month of October ending on Halloween, Mitt Romney led nationwide and in a number of battleground states. And yet, Barack Obama was far underestimated in the polls. Just something to think about when you look forward to the 2024 election and say, what can we expect on Election night? Not saying it's going to happen. If anything was like 2016, Donald Trump has a blowout election and completely demolishes this electoral map. But the opposite could happen too. Because every race is so close, there is no consistency, there is no genuine knowing as to how this race is going to go with full certainty. But this is the closest I could get. 278 for Donald Trump, 260 for Kamala Harris, a victory for the Republican Party, the first one I've predicted, with Vice President Harris on the ballot, but there's still time to change things up, but that time is counting down. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.